If you've ever wondered why a witch's spellbook calls for the eye of a newt, when the real ingredient may have been a common spice sitting in a kitchen cupboard, or how a patch of moldy grain was blamed for sending a whole town to the gallows for witchcraft, and many more secrets besides, stay with us. Eye of Newt. The most famous line in Shakespeare's Macbeth sends three witches reaching for Eye of Newt, and for centuries readers pictured a real amphibian eyeball dropped into the cauldron. The plant lore says otherwise. Eye of Newt is widely said to be an old folk name for the humble mustard seed, one of a whole secret vocabulary that cunning folk and herbalists use to disguise their recipes from outsiders. Grinding a spell ingredient down to a common kitchen spice served two purposes at once. It kept a healer's knowledge private, and it made a simple herbal remedy sound powerful and mysterious. Whether Shakespeare knew the code or simply wanted something grotesque is still debated, but the idea that the terrifying Eye of Newt was really a pinch of mustard has become one of the best-loved twists in the history of witchcraft. Mandrake. Few plants carry a darker legend than the mandrake, a Mediterranean root whose forked shape can look eerily like a human body, complete with two splayed legs. Ancient and medieval writers claimed the root screamed when pulled from the ground, a shriek so terrible it could kill or madden anyone who heard it. The standard advice was to tie a dog to the plant and let the animal drag it free, so the curse fell on the dog instead of the gatherer. Behind the myth sits a genuinely dangerous plant. Mandrake is loaded with tropane alkaloids that can cause hallucinations, delirium, and death, and in small, careful doses it was used by early surgeons as an anesthetic and sedative. It is hallucinogenic and highly poisonous, never something to experiment with. The screaming was invented, but the danger was entirely real. Tongue of dog. Another grim entry from the witch's cabinet turns out to be a roadside weed. Tongue of dog is a folk name for houndstongue, a plant whose long, soft, gray-green leaves were thought to resemble a dog's tongue, both in shape and in their rough, velvety feel. Across old herbals, the plant was named for the animal it looked like, part of a long tradition where a leaf shaped like an ear, a tongue, or an eye was used to treat that very part of the body. Houndstongue itself is mildly toxic and smells faintly of mice, and it was once worked into ointments for burns and bruises. The witch's shopping list of tongues and ears and hairs was rarely a menagerie of animals. It was a garden of plants named for the body parts they seemed to mimic. Wolfsbane. Not every dark ingredient hides a harmless herb. Wolfsbane, also called aconite or monkshood, is one of the most poisonous plants in Europe. Tall and elegant with deep blue-purple hooded flowers. Its name comes from its old use as a poison to kill wolves, smeared on bait or arrow tips, and every part of the plant is dangerously toxic. The poison, aconitine, is potent enough that it can be absorbed through the skin, and even bare-handed handling has left gardeners numb and ill. In folklore, wolfsbane was tied to werewolves, used both to ward them off and, in some tales, to summon the change. Witches were said to blend it into a flying ointment, and its power to cause a racing heart, tingling skin, and a floating, delirious sensation is very real. It is a true killer, and no part of it should ever be touched without gloves. Toe of frog. Back to the cauldron's coded language, the toe of frog from Macbeth is often explained as another disguised plant, most commonly the leaf or root of a buttercup. Buttercups belong to a family full of sharp, blistering plants, and their creeping leaves were sometimes thought to resemble a small webbed foot. Some herbal traditions instead link toe of frog to bulbous buttercup roots, which look like little pale toes when dug from the ground. Either way, the ingredient was botanical, not amphibian. Fresh buttercup sap is genuinely irritating and can raise blisters on the skin, which gave the plant a fittingly witchy reputation. The pattern repeats across the whole spell. What sounds like a bucket of frogs, bats, and lizards was, in this older reading, a well-stocked herb garden written in a private and deliberately frightening code. Belladonna. Deadly nightshade earns its darkest name honestly. Belladonna is Italian for beautiful woman, and the plant was so called because Renaissance women dripped its juice into their eyes to widen the pupils and create a dreamy, seductive stare. The chemical behind it, atropine, does exactly that, and eye doctors still use a refined version today. The rest of the plant is lethal. Its glossy black berries are sweet enough to tempt children, and only a few can kill, shutting the body down with a racing heart, blurred vision, and delirium. Witches were said to use belladonna in flying ointments, and its hallucinations of flight and transformation gave real weight to the legend of the broomstick. It is one of the most toxic plants in the Western world, beautiful, historic, and genuinely deadly in the smallest dose. Adder's tongue. Despite the venomous name, this is a plant, a small, curious fern named for the single narrow, tongue-like spike that rises from its leaf and tapers to a point like a snake's flicking tongue. Old herbalists, following the belief that a plant's shape revealed its purpose, used adder's tongue in salves for wounds and snakebite precisely because it looked the part. The fern is harmless and easy to miss, tucked low in old, undisturbed meadows, and it was gathered to make a soothing green ointment for cuts and grazes. There is also an adder's tongue among the lilies, an American wildflower with speckled leaves. But in the witch's vocabulary, the name almost always points to the fern, one more reptile on the spell list that turns out to be a quiet plant of the field. Fly agaric. The storybook toadstool, brilliant red and dotted with white flecks, is the most recognizable mushroom on Earth, and one of the most steeped in magic. Fly agaric is genuinely psychoactive, containing mus-e-hamol, a compound that brings on a dreamlike, intoxicated state along with nausea and confusion. Its name comes from the old habit of breaking it into milk to stun flies. Across northern Europe and Siberia, it threads through folklore, from the flying reindeer of the far north to the toadstool rings where fairies were said to dance. Some writers even tie its red and white cap to older midwinter traditions. It is toxic and unpredictable, capable of real poisoning, and never a safe thing to eat. But its place in the human imagination, from fairy tale to cauldron, is matched by no other mushroom. Bloody fingers. The tall spire of purple bells known as foxglove hides behind a whole cluster of ominous country names, among them bloody fingers, dead man's bells, and witches' gloves. The flowers are just the right size to slip over a fingertip, and the darker legends claimed that witches gave them to foxes to wear, or that hearing the bells ring meant death was near. The dread was earned. Foxglove is powerfully toxic, its leaves loaded with compounds that seize control of the heartbeat and can stop it altogether. Yet that same poison, isolated in the 1700s, became digitalis, one of the most important heart medicines in history, still used in a purified form to steady a failing heart. Here the witch's plant and the doctor's cure are the very same leaf, separated only by the size of the dose. Henbane. Among the true witching herbs, henbane sits beside belladonna and mandrake in the deadly nightshade family, a sticky, foul-smelling plant with pale, veined, yellowish flowers. Its name means killer of hens, and every part is poisonous, rich in the same delirium-inducing alkaloids that run through its darker cousins. Henbane was a staple of the legendary flying ointments, and the sensations it produces, a racing pulse, distorted vision, and the overwhelming feeling of rushing through the air, map disturbingly well onto old confessions of night flight to the witch's Sabbath. It was also used, cautiously, as a painkiller and sleeping draught in early medicine, and less cautiously as a poison. Its alkaloid hyoscine was the weapon in one of the most famous London murder trials of the early 20th century, when Dr. Crippen used it to kill his wife. It is not a beautiful plant, but few are more tightly bound to the real history of witchcraft. Lion's tooth. After a parade of poisons, one fearsome-sounding ingredient is really the most familiar weed in the world. Lion's tooth is simply the dandelion, its English name a straight translation of the French don de lion, a nod to the jagged, tooth-edged leaves. Far from sinister, the whole plant is edible, and was long valued as food and medicine. The young leaves were eaten as a bitter spring salad, the roots were roasted into a coffee substitute, and the golden flowers were fermented into a country wine. In old herbals, the dandelion was a gentle remedy for the liver, and a mild diuretic, a reputation preserved in another blunt folk name, wet the bed. On the witch's list of teeth and claws and tongues, the lion's tooth is the reminder that many of these terrible names hid nothing more dangerous than a lawn weed. Wormwood. A genuinely bitter herb with silvery, feathery leaves, wormwood has haunted the edges of magic and medicine for thousands of years. Its name reflects its oldest use, as a remedy to expel intestinal worms, and its taste is so intensely bitter that it became a byword for anything harsh and painful. Wormwood's real fame came as the soul of absinthe, the green spirit adored by 19th-century artists and blamed, wrongly, for madness and hallucination. The suspected culprit was thujon, a compound in the plant, though modern analysis shows old absinthe held far less than the legend claimed, and it was mostly the sheer strength of the alcohol doing the damage. In folklore, wormwood was hung to ward off evil and burned to summon spirits. Bitter, aromatic, and faintly dangerous, it remains one of the most storied plants ever put in a bottle. Wool of bat. Returning to the witch's coated shelf, the wool of bat from the same Macbeth brew is generally read as another plant name, most often holly or moss. The soft, downy underside of certain leaves, or the fuzzy carpet of moss on a north-facing tree, could be pictured as fine wool clinging to a bat, and both were folded into the private language of the herbalist. Some readings instead point to the woolly foliage of a plant like mullein, whose thick, soft leaves are so downy they were once used as lamp wicks and rough bandages. The exact plant is lost to time, but the principle is the same one running through the whole spell. A brew that sounds like a nightmare of skinned animals was, to those who knew the code, a careful mix of leaves, moss, and herbs hiding in plain sight. Ergot. This is the ingredient that turned imagined witchcraft into real catastrophe. Ergot is a dark, spur-shaped fungus that grows on rye and other grains in cool, damp seasons, and eating the tainted flower causes ergotism, a horrifying poisoning of two kinds. One form burns and rots the limbs, once called St. Anthony's fire. The other brings violent convulsions, crawling skin, and vivid hallucinations. Historians have argued that outbreaks of ergot poisoning, striking whole villages after a wet harvest, lie behind some of the great witch panics, including the accusations at Salem in 1692, where the strange fits of the afflicted matched the symptoms closely. The theory is debated, but the chemistry is not. The same fungus was later studied in a Swiss laboratory, where its compounds became the raw material for the first synthesis of the drug LSD. A blight on bread became one of the strangest chapters in medical history. Dragon's blood. The last name on the shelf sounds the most fantastical, and it is one of the few still sold under its magical name today. Dragon's blood is a bright red resin, and for 2,000 years traders insisted it was the dried blood of dragons killed in battle with elephants. In truth, it seeps from several unrelated plants, most famously the dragon's blood tree of the island of Socotra, whose umbrella-shaped crown weeps a crimson sap when the bark is cut. The resin was prized as a dye, a varnish for violins, a medicine to stop bleeding, and an ingredient in ritual and folk magic, burned as incense or used to ink protective charms. It is still gathered and sold in shops today, one witch's ingredient whose eerie name survived intact, because the truth behind it, a tree that bleeds red, was strange enough on its own. Almost every terror on the witch's shelf turns out to be one of two things: a common herb dressed in a frightening name to guard a healer's secrets, or a genuinely deadly plant whose poison was real enough to earn the fear. Let us know in the comments which cursed ingredient we should brew up next.